Hey, this is Brian. This is the HVC School podcast. Yes, this is a podcast, and I am doing it as a live stream, which is something I told you that I would not do anymore. I told you I would not put up podcasts, but I wanted to try something a little bit different, which is to do a short episode. Just do it live, and maybe at the end we can answer some questions. So this is going to be a short episode. It's not going to take very long, and if you don't have time to watch it live with me right now, you can watch it later. But feel free to ask questions as I go along. And before we get started, I want to thank our sponsors. Some of our sponsors who make HVAC School possible. I want to thank Carrier.com. Of course, I need to thank Refrigeration Technologies, Mike and John Pastorello, those guys, makers of Viper and Nylog and all the really good quality stuff that comes from the needs of the field. Thank you to those guys, and thank you to Speed Clean. Speed Clean is a new sponsor of the podcast, and if you haven't looked at their bib cleaning kits for ductless systems, they make one specifically for cassettes. You're going to see more and more cassette ductless systems out there, and you're going to want to have one of these bib kits on your truck in case you run into needing to clean one. Makes it a lot easier than pulling it all apart. Sometimes it makes more sense to pull it apart, but we've run into several cases where it's very difficult to get the blowers out in order to clean them. So you're going to want to check that out, and you can find out more at speedclean.com. And then also I want to thank Navac. Navac's been a longtime supporter. You guys know a lot of their products, navacglobal.com. And then Fieldpiece is a new sponsor as well, and we've been doing a lot with their probes lately. We really like their MR45 and VP85. That's their recovery machine and their vacuum pump. So thank you to Fieldpiece. All right, so today we're going to talk quickly about my philosophy that I'm developing as it surrounds education and the challenge of information. And a lot of this comes from my own experience, and a lot of it comes from people like Seth Godin. If you haven't read anything or listened to Seth Godin, he's a kind of a new thinker as it regards marketing, but then also business and education in general. And one of the big things is that I think we have to change our mindset that education is not for information. Education is not for information. It's not for just packing our heads full of information, because the information is so easily accessible that you can get the information anytime you need it. And so for example, let's just use an example here. Let's say that I want to know about the latest, probes that are on the market and how I can use them to calculate total system delivered capacity and cooling or heating. Well, do I need to really memorize the total heat calculation, or can I utilize it when I need it by doing a little just-in-time education, read a quick article, whatever? Is there anything wrong with learning that stuff beforehand? The answer is no. Of course, there's nothing wrong with learning it. But the point of learning it is not to simply have the information, because the information is accessible anytime that we need it. So whenever we're ready, we can get the information. It's more about teaching people how to learn and how to find what they need when they need it in an efficient way, and to have the tools and language accessible to them, so that way they can learn what you need them to learn when you need them to learn it. So for example, if you want to learn the latest features on a vacuum pump, or the way to use the NRP ATI vacuum pump, for example, because you've never used a digital pump before. Well, you need to know what a vacuum pump is, and you need to know what a vacuum pump does, but it's not so much about the information as it is about the language and context of a vacuum pump and how it's used. So as an example, if I walk up to a kid, and we'll give a perfect example of this. I walk up to a kid, we're talking about a vacuum pump, and I start talking to him about a vacuum pump, what it is and what it does. He's not going to have enough language. He or she's not going to have enough language in the core philosophy behind a vacuum pump for that to even mean anything to them. They're not going to be interested in it. They're not going to care. On the other hand, if I bring a vacuum pump, I set it down in front of them, I take a vessel of water, a vacuum chamber, a vessel full of water, and I pull a vacuum on it, and I show them that water boiling out of that vessel, they're going to be like, wow, that's really cool. What's happening here? And then I can explain the boiling of water, and I can show them the vacuum pump and what it does, and I can talk about what's inside of it. And I can use language like evacuation and boiling point and saturation point and all this. And while they're not going to necessarily understand all of that the first time around, they're going to start to develop a context for things like, what is a vacuum pump? What is evacuation? What is boiling point? What is saturation? We can talk about all those things in context. And so a lot of people say things like, I'm a hands-on learner, and that means that I have to do it in order to learn it. And there may be some truth to that, but I think that's a little bit overrated. It's more that we as educators, we as employers, we as the industry have to do a better job of recognizing that we can't just throw information at people who don't have context first and expect them to grasp it. That's just going to lead to frustration. We have to demonstrate ideas. So we have to use better use of metaphor. We have to get people excited about the whys. So before you teach somebody about a concept, why do they care? So you want to talk about liquid refrigerant migration into a compressor. Let's talk about what causes compressors to fail. Let's talk about the importance of temperature and lubrication in a compressor and all those sorts of things before we start talking about maybe an ambiguous concept like an accumulator. So if you first are being taught about an accumulator without really understanding the importance of liquid refrigerant migration, then that's going to seem like that's going to be a foreign. It's going to be a disambiguated. I think that's a word. Maybe I shouldn't use that word because maybe you don't have a context for it. It's an idea that isn't connected to experience that you've had, something that you've been able to visually experience or had demonstrated to you. So what's the point? The point is that I'm a big believer in giving people experiences before you provide them with information. And even then, the information should support them in finding the broader world of answers rather than just giving them answers. So, for example, you teach somebody how to use the MeasureQuick app. That's great. But what's better is to show them the equipment and how it's done, then show them the MeasureQuick app, and they can see how that solves a problem for them. They can see how it makes it easier. So you've given them perspective, you've given them context, and now you've provided them with a tool that can provide them with answers. And that's always better than just giving somebody an answer. You give somebody an answer, they're going to forget it next time, and they're just going to come back to you because humans are adaptive. So that's it. That's really all I wanted to say here. I think our relationship to knowing the answers and teaching people the answers is broken. I think we have to instead be much more proactive in the demonstration first, the experience that people get before they start to learn all of the whys. And that's the opposite of how it's often done in school. In school, often they drum the theory, and the theory becomes something that's very ethereal. It doesn't mean anything to them. And then we try to give them some shop experience, and they don't connect the two. I would much rather give them some shop experience, some field experience, some context, the why, and then explain it. Because now it makes sense. Oh, the reason why you pull a vacuum is because you have to get water out. And why do we want to get water out? Because water causes corrosion and other reactions inside the system that make that sludgy, nasty oil, create that damage inside the compressor. And I think we've all sort of fallen down on the job with this because it's much easier to pull people into a class and just start drilling them with facts. And we know that doesn't work. Those of us in the field know that doesn't work. So we need to be more active about demonstrating. And that's going to need to happen by getting people into the field more quickly, whether or not they're actually exposed to doing a lot of the work or not. I think we overemphasize the actual physical doing, although that is important to develop the skill. Initially, I would much rather, it's like when you take your kid and you show them how to change a tire. You don't say, hey, son, go change the tire. You have them watch you and you show the entire aspect of jacking up the car and removing the lug nuts and your tightening pattern on the lug nuts. And so they have this understanding of tactily what that's like before they get a chance to actually do it. So if I had my way, I would like to demonstrate to people, then teach theory, then have them do it, and then just keep repeating that cycle over and over and over. And so that there's always that interplay between those two concepts. All right. I've got 2 minutes before I got a phone call. So let's see if we got any questions here. I know a lot of people say you have to learn in the field, but but that is the main gains of going to school. Yeah. I mean, so going to school has value. I just think we have to rethink how we do schooling. I think we have to rethink what we're doing from a demonstration standpoint. And I think schooling needs to have more very practical demonstrations, the sorts of things that happen in the field. They need to physically see it step by step, that process. And hopefully that's what some of us are doing on YouTube. So you get a chance to see what it's like to replace a compressor soup to nuts, what it's like to connect, hoses to a vacuum pump, what it's like to use a micron gauge, what it's like to flow nitrogen while brazing. These things that often don't get done in the field because it hasn't been demonstrated to the technician out in the field. Will MeasureQuick be compatible with UEI Hub 6 in the future? I don't know. I know they're in talks. That's not my area. Unfortunately, Jim Bergman is the one to ask. School is good, but only when it goes along with the practice, is what Jose says. And yes, schooling is important. I'm not saying because you can't learn the theory and the math. You're not going to learn that unless you are taught it, unless you are intentional about it. But the best way to learn something is to become curious about it and then to be a learner of your own accord. So going out to the books, going out to the podcasts, going out and finding that information, those people learn. I talked to Joe Shearer. He's a great technician in Florida, and he's almost entirely self-taught because he had a desire to learn it. He experienced it, and then he had a desire to learn it. And as we as educators and as owners and as reps and as OEMs and as wholesalers, we have to be more proactive on the demonstration of things rather than just the theoretical teaching. And I'm as guilty of as anybody else. I do a lot of theoretical teaching, and that is necessary. But I think the order has to be changed a little bit, where people have the perspective that comes from seeing it really done and knowing what all goes into that, and maybe some of the challenges and trials that go along with that. And so I think a big piece of this is companies that are doing the work in the field need to work much more closely with educators, and we need to bring those two things together so that way new people who are interested in the field have a chance to work in the field, even if they're not working, but maybe getting out there and seeing it. There's a lot of things to work out. There's legality, there's insurance, there's all this stuff. I'm going to take on some of these issues over the next, decade of making it easier for people who want to get a real education, a real perspective, to get out there and see it physically done before they're taught it theoretically. And I think that'll help a lot with people learning to do it the right way the first time. I think that's a big piece of that. So I thank you all so much for watching. This will be on the podcast channel. So hopefully you share it there. And I'm not going to do this very often. This will be just an occasional sort of replacement for my short episode. So this will be out in a week or so. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you again soon.